Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Cefas Science Conference, Future Ocean Science Under the Surface. My name is Neil Hornby and I'm the Chief Executive of Cefas. This is the first time we've held our science conference virtually, but I'm delighted to see so many friends and colleagues with us this morning. I know we've colleagues here from across the UK and around the world, and you're all very welcome. We have an absolutely fascinating day ahead today. A chance for both Cefas colleagues and some of our external partners to share the amazing science they're doing and the difference it's making to protecting our environment and safeguarding human and animal health. We're very fortunate to be starting shortly with some words from the DEFRA Secretary of State, George Eustace, before moving into sessions this morning on food from water and safe seas. We will then have a panel session involving leading scientists from outside Cefas, chaired by Gideon Henderson, DEFRA's Chief Scientific Advisor, before further sessions on biodiversity and climate change this afternoon. Alongside all this, there are a number of side events running during the day on a range of topics, as well as an online poster exhibition and lots of activity on social media. And please do use the hashtag FutureOcean21 if you're tweeting. This year's conference has a particular focus on sharing some of our international work, given the importance of this year in securing new commitments to global ocean protection and recovery and the start of the UN Decade of Ocean Science. The G Summit at the weekend, we saw G7 countries confirming their intention to lead the way in tackling the challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change, including through the announcement of a new nature compact and the launch of the Blue Planet Fund. We also all hope for similar levels of ambition from all countries when the Convention on Biological Diversity meets in October and the Climate Change Conference COP26 meets here in the UK in November. Science is absolutely central to delivering the UK government's objectives for our environment, both in providing the evidence which demonstrates the need for action, but also in helping to develop the right solutions to solve many of the challenges we face. I know just how amazing the work Cefas does is, and I'm delighted we're going to be able to share some of it with you today. To start today, we're going to play a short video that's been put together by Cefas colleagues to introduce you to some of our people and explain what they do. And as they used to say, run VT.
The Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science is a leader in the international marine and freshwater science sector. Well, what does this mean? Let's dive in.
This means we help keep our rivers and ocean healthy and productive, and our seafood safe and sustainable.
Our scientists use a breadth of surveying, mapping and sampling techniques to collect and analyse data that are trustworthy and valuable.
We use our state-of-the-art research vessel, the Cefas Endeavour, autonomous marine platforms, remotely piloted aircraft and satellite data to monitor and assess the health of our waters.
We collect evidence, analyse our findings and provide advice to a variety of partners such as UK and international governments, industry, NGOs, research bodies and the public.
It's important that we share our scientific knowledge worldwide to contribute to a global sustainable blue future.
We have 4 international centres of excellence that help develop our collaborations and reputation internationally.
In recognition of 2021, the Ocean Super Year, we are proud to present some highlights of our work.
It's almost impossible to describe all of the science that happens at Cefas, so today we will explore 4 key themes.
Food from water.
Safe seas.
Biodiversity.
Climate change.
The ocean provides micronutrients, food and protein for millions of people, so it's essential to understand the journey from plankton to plate.
So we here analyse plankton communities using our advanced lab facilities, mainly by microscopy, to try and understand these fundamental species of the food web.
We collect catch and discard data on board commercial fishing vessels.
And collect landings data at markets and ports around England and Wales.
We work with anglers to learn about what they catch and what this might mean for wider fish populations.
We also study fish in their natural environment to find out where they live and discover how far they travel.
This information allows us to formulate advice with international working groups and model predictions of future impacts and management.
Increasingly, fish protein consists of farmed and wild-caught fish. We help to maintain the food security of millions by supporting the growing aquaculture sector.
Alongside these fish, seaweed and shellfish are emerging aquaculture species which have the potential to become an important crop around the UK coast.
Safe seas. Our work to keep our seas safe includes monitoring and measuring water quality and pollution.
We respond to environmental emergencies, such as oil or chemical spills, radioactive leaks, and disease outbreaks.
Working from catchment to coast, we examine the impacts of marine contaminants and toxins, marine litter, invasive species, and even underwater noise.
We help develop monitoring protocols to support international partners in improving aquatic health in the ecosystems.
In doing so, we encourage a One Health approach, linking human, animal, and environmental health.
We work with regulators and seafood producers to assess the use of pharmaceuticals to tackle the challenge of antimicrobial resistance.
Our Fish Health Inspectorate are also responsible for controlling serious diseases in aquatic animals in England and Wales.
We detect, diagnose and describe new and emerging pathogens of fish and shellfish using novel techniques such as environmental DNA sequencing.
Biodiversity. Conserving biodiversity is critical to maintaining the health and resilience of our ocean ecosystems, and therefore our very own survival.
We map biodiversity and human pressures to help reduce impacts on the environment.
We provide advice on the status and design of marine protected areas in the UK and overseas territories to help maintain robust and biodiverse aquatic communities.
Our work provides evidence and advice to a broad range of national governments, public bodies and local authorities, as well as commercial businesses, to help gauge what level of human pressure is sustainable.
From DNA to microscopic plankton to even the largest marine mammals, Cefas consider all aspects of biodiversity and how they interact.
We also explore the physical and chemical properties of the environment, which can influence species diversity.
We develop indicators of ecosystem health and provide advice on how to protect and manage these systems for current and future generations.
Climate change remains one of the most important challenges facing humanity.
We work to understand how changes to the marine environment, such as warming oceans, ocean acidification and sea level rise, will continue into the future.
From understanding the natural climatic variability we see in our seas to monitoring ocean systems and environmental change.
We use historical data to assess how climate has changed over time and use models to predict future changes to our aquatic environment.
From protecting coral reefs in our overseas territories to understanding the role of UK shelf seas in carbon capture.
We work with local experts to gather evidence of climate change impacts into easy-to-read report cards for policymakers, fishing and other industries, and coastal communities.
We identify mitigation adaptation measures to improve the resilience of our ecosystems and society to our changing climate.
So now you know a bit more about Cefas and how we're working towards a sustainable blue future for our oceans. Let's dive under the surface of our science. We hope you enjoy the conference.
Great, thanks for that. I hope you all enjoyed that. You got a bit of insight into some of our colleagues and what we do. Fantastic video there. Thanks everyone for contributing to that. And now I'd like to introduce our opening speaker, the DEFRA Secretary of State, George Eustace, who I'm really pleased has been able to join us today. The Secretary of State's worked closely with Cefas for many years, and I'm very grateful he was able to find the time to be with us today. So, Secretary of State, good morning, welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. And of course, I've worked with you for many years as well during your time in the department, but it's a real pleasure to be able to attend your virtual conference today. My view, having had 7 years in the department, Cefas is an absolute centre of excellence in fisheries science and aquaculture and ocean science. In my view, the preeminent scientific institution that we've got in the world, and indeed a lot of the work you do is not just here in our own waters on fisheries science, but of course globally as well, advising countries right around the world on things like marine protected areas. And I can see you've got a very important agenda today, but I wanted to just touch on a couple of key areas where we're seeing quite a lot of change, where there's an important agenda this year. The first is that obviously now that we've left the European Union, we're going to put a really renewed focus on fisheries management, and in particular getting the right technical conservation measures in our domestic waters. You will know that previously, as an EU member, technical conservation measures were decided by the European Commission. We fed in our thoughts and our ideas, but often it wasn't possible to get the scientifically optimum outcome from that. Now, one of the opportunities we've got now that we have left the European Union is to be able to unilaterally set what those measures should be, and then to require vessels from other countries, third countries like the European Union, seeking to access our waters to follow those same measures. So I'm interested in looking further at the role for cameras on vessels, for instance, looking further at how we can refine even more than we have so far, the getting the technical response right on particular gear types so that we can improve selectivity, looking at closures and management options in some of our marine protected areas, looking at how we can make sense of the mixed fisheries like those in the Celtic Sea where we've had long running challenges. These are all things now where the government wants to draw heavily on the scientific expertise within Cefas so that we can really break through and start getting changes and improvements where they've remained difficult and elusive for many, many years. The second key thing I would say is, alongside that and allied to that, we are considering ways to substantially increase a fisheries science partnership. We've had some good examples of that in recent years, particularly things like fully documented fishing in the North Sea and other science partnerships as well. We're looking at the option now of a UK science partnership between the fishing industry, between Cefas and our scientists, so that we can really drive and improve the understanding of how we can fish sustainably. And then finally, of course, this is a really big year for the environment internationally. I was in Cornwall last week attending a number of events linked to and surrounding the G7. That is the first important milestone on the way to a much bigger event that obviously we've got later in the year. We will be setting new biodiversity targets at CBD COP15 at Kunming. And the Leaders Pledge for Nature that the UK government has brought together has been trying to drive ambition on that through both the G7 and also in the run-up to COP26. We've also been working with the High Ambition Coalition and the Oceans Alliance that we've put together to get many more countries to commit that we should be protecting 30% of our oceans by 2030. We've now got well over 80 countries that are signed up to that pledge, and we'll be seeking to push that further. And then, of course, we've got the Blue Planet Fund, which is going to support projects and marine conservation projects right around the world, helping support other countries to do what we're already starting to do, which is to look at designating more areas of our marine environment for protection and looking at improving the measures we put in place within that for protection. And the other key thing that came out of G7 was a commitment, and this is something that John Kerry and the US were starting to show quite an interest in getting better management on the high seas, dealing with the issue of problem or illegal fishing in areas where there isn't any national jurisdiction, trying to get a proper accord on how internationally we should approach fishing pressures on the high seas. That's a really important breakthrough. So it's a really big year, both domestically, because it's the first year that we're outside the European Union, and that frees us up to really have a science evidence-based approach to many of these issues, particularly around technical conservation measures, and also a big year internationally. And I very much welcome all of the work that you and your colleagues and the teams, both at Lowestoft and at Weybridge and elsewhere, are doing. I very much look forward to the time when I'm going to be able to visit you all properly again. I know that in my time that Lowestoft is an area where there was some discussion about relocating that site. I was very keen that it stayed there, and very pleased that we've got some new investment in that site. And of course, Weybridge as well, where you do all of that fantastic work on fish health and aquaculture, and probably, assuming they're still there and still living, probably the best cared for carp in the world in your reception. But thank you very much, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your kind words, and you'd be very welcome in Lowestoft or Weymouth whenever we could get you to come and see us. Very much so. And also very grateful for you sharing some of your insight there, both about where we're going in fisheries management. Certainly a very exciting time ahead there, and with everything that's happening this year around kind of global ocean protection, obviously huge opportunities for the UK to show that international leadership. You have agreed to take a few questions, so we've had a few questions submitted by conference participants. The first of which is about highly protected marine areas. So these are areas that can be used to provide evidence of how our marine environment could look in its natural state if all damaging human activity was removed. So could you say a bit more about the government's long-term vision for HPMAs?
Yes, we've did our response now to the Benyon review, and I think the Benyon review was powerful in that it demonstrated that if you have those highly protected areas where you prevent all extraction and all human activity, then you can actually get a real recovery in the environment in those areas. And what we said we're going to do is to pilot a number of areas, probably around 5 areas. We're starting the work now to identify what the right areas are. But the reason I'm attracted to this concept is it's absolutely in line with what we are now trying to do in a sort of post-EU era, which is to take a rather different approach than we've done in recent decades. Rather than trying to have an approach where you're just trying to protect an ever-dwindling natural resource, protecting certain areas, trying to mitigate and slow down the decline of nature. What we absolutely have to do, both on land and at sea, is to create the circumstances where we can see nature recovery. And of course, we've now set a target to reverse and halt the decline of biodiversity by 2030. To achieve that, it's not enough just to have old style protections where you think about how you mitigate damage. We actually have to try to build back nature. And that may well mean designated areas where there isn't a huge amount of nature now, but where we know if you designate them and leave them alone or manage them in a particular way, that you'll see nature's recovery and see marine life come back. So that's why we want to take this forward. We have to also look at it in the context of the ambitions for dramatic increases in offshore wind in order to hit our carbon targets. And I know climate change is one of the issues on your agenda this year, obviously a huge environmental threat, including to our oceans. But there are also some environmental challenges with that scale of offshore wind development. And one of the things that I'm interested in exploring further, allied to the concept of highly protected marine areas, is whether in some instances we may be able to designate special protections around areas where wind energy is established, to try to get nature being recovered there as well. And I think it's a complex issue because obviously when you decommission these sites or replace cables, there's damage associated with that. But I am keen that we can explore whether we can use that opportunity of increased offshore wind development with potential as well to create spaces for nature and for marine life to return.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you, Secretary. Well, we've got lots of colleagues who would be delighted to help work on some things like that. Some really interesting challenges there. The next question is on COVID wastewater surveillance, where, as you may know, Cefas has been conducting the analysis of our genomic capability, which has also helped predict some of the hotspots of transmission. So the question from our colleagues is, do you think there's scope for this new UK capability to be used more widely for existing and emerging public health threats in future? And I think my hint is that the questioner thinks there might be.
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary what we were able to do. And between the Environment Agency and Cefas, the work that you've done on COVID has been quite extraordinary, because it's enabled us to, without having to have convoluted testing, although we've done that as well, it has enabled us to detect particular spikes in particular parts, even down to particular areas within particular postcodes within given cities. So it's been an extraordinary development, that ability to detect and also detect different strains showing up in the wastewater so that we can see trends. And often it's been a lead indicator that we've seen that come ahead of people showing symptoms and testing in areas picking up problems. So it's acted as an early warning system. So I think it's been a really interesting development. All credit to those that have been involved in perfecting that in a very, very short timescale. And it may well, of course, have utility in managing other disease pressures as well in other future pandemics. And I'm sure it's something we'll want to learn from.
Great, yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, no, I think we're really proud that we've been able to sort of play our part in helping support some of that work. Moving on a bit to plastic pollution. As you know, Cefas does a lot of work around the world helping countries prevent plastic pollution of the marine environment. So I think everyone was a bit concerned to see the reports of UK plastic waste that had been exported to Turkey kind of being dumped and ended up in the sea there. So the question is, what's DEFRA's response to some of those concerns?
Yeah, it is always shocking when we're doing all this work to ban plastic stirrers and have a levy on carrier bags, and very high. This issue is very, very high on the public consciousness. Everybody, lots of people taking part in beach cleans and litter picks. Public consciousness on this has never been higher, and it's therefore incredibly demoralizing when we see waste being, in some cases, I think illegal, well, definitely illegally dumped, I think in the case of Turkey, and in some cases, possibly being, illegally shipped to countries that aren't able to cope with it. So there has been some work being done in this area. We're looking at legislative change to ban the export of waste to sort of non-OECD countries. So you remove this problem of exporting it to countries where something might go wrong, where you can't necessarily trust that the waste will be dealt with in the right way. But also the Environment Agency have been upping their work to deal with some of that illegal export. I think they intercepted 63 containers last year, and they've also prevented an extra 100 containers this year potentially being exported to Turkey. So there was a lot of concern when this story first broke last summer, and the Environment Agency have acted and have intercepted and stopped some of those exports.
Great, thank you. Now we've got a fisheries management question, picking up some of what you said in your remarks, this time on sea bass, which I know is a favourite subject of yours. So the question is, what would DEFRA do to close the loopholes that allow illegal targeting of sea bass in Cornwall and further protect this vulnerable species now that we've left the EU?
Yeah, the measures we have on sea bass are far from perfect, but as Neil will recall, it was the UK that got any measures at all. When I first became Fisheries Minister, we could never get other EU countries to take this seriously. It was only really when the stock was run right down that in around 2015, we pushed this very, very hard and effectively shamed the European Commission into taking emergency measures. What they then did in the usual way was a little bit clunky, but largely dealt with the problem of pair trawling, which is where the biggest mortality was taking place when French pair trawlers in particular were hitting the stock right during its spawning season. So we managed to stop that. We managed to have limited allocations for hand liners predominantly, and then a small exemption for some gill netters getting bycatch inland. And then we progressively sort of tried to revise that so that there's a bit more allowance for bycatch for sort of trawlers, otter trawls that might be catching some bass. So that the measures are far from perfect. They could be improved, but they are better than what went before, which was nothing at all. And actually, the measures we put in place have now started to make, I think, quite a significant contribution to the recovery of sea bass around our shores. I know there's a particular challenge that the IFCA in Cornwall has raised with me about, and it's less about illegal targeting of bass. It's fact that when they run into bass, if they haven't got the catch limit, then legally all they can do is discard. And so we have had some instances of large numbers of bass actually being discarded. And there was one instance where it was in the estuary in Hale in my constituency. This caused a huge amount of concern locally. When I investigated it, the IFCA told me that actually it was sadly lawfully dumped because that was the only thing that could be done with it. But it just shows the difficulty and the unintended consequences that you can get with these sorts of measures. So I'm very much open to proposals on how we can refine these measures further. We've chosen not to make any big changes this year because we had quite enough fights to have with the European Union. But obviously next year it would be open to us to adopt technical measures that make sense and that depart somewhat from those followed by the European Union. But I wouldn't want to do that in a way that meant the European Union abandoned any measures at all.
Thank you, Secretary. And I think that's probably all we've got time for. But again, thank you so much for coming today, for sharing your thoughts, for answering those questions, and for all your ongoing support for Cefas. And we look forward to seeing you in Lowestoft or Weymouth very soon. But thanks again for coming today, Secretary. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. I hope the conference goes well.
Thank you.
Bye.
And I'm going to hand over to Stuart Rogers to introduce our next session. Stuart.
Morning, everyone. Hello, I'm Stuart Rogers. I'm Chief Scientist at Cefas, and I'll be taking you through the programme for the rest of the day. We've got a great day ahead of us. We've got short talks, we've got keynotes, videos, we've got breakout groups, presentations from our students, truly something for everyone. So without further delay, let's introduce the speakers for the first of our 4 sessions on food from water. So our first speaker is Julia Blanchard. Now, Julia is an associate professor at the University of Tasmania in Hobart. She's a leading reputation in how marine ecosystems respond to change. That's both climate as well as human-induced change. And she's giving us a talk entitled Food from Water into the Future. She'll be followed by 4 short talks by Cefas from Elisa Capuzzo, Andy Turner, Paul Dolder, and Chibuza Nanatu. So, without further delay, let's hear from Julia Blanchard. Julia, over to you.
Future. And so it's especially an honor because I'm myself am a former Cefas researcher, and I'm really excited to hear about all of the work coming out on this topic from Cefas these days. So I'm going to focus a little bit about why we need to understand wider food system linkages to answer questions related to the future of aquatic foods. First of all, we know that there's a rising demand for fish and seafood in total due to the growth in human population. But there also has tended to be this shift over the past several decades towards higher relative consumption, that is per capita consumption of fish and seafood has more than doubled since the 1960s. And the recognition of seafood and fish as being highly nutritious and also maybe less environmentally impactful compared to other sources of animal protein, for example, land-based animal protein, has led to several international initiatives. The one on the previous slide I mentioned was the Blue Food Assessment, which encompasses all food from all aquatic environments. But also the Ocean Panel, planetary health initiatives, the Sustainable Development Goals, all highlight the importance of and benefits of blue foods into the future. And the paper opinion piece here in PNAS that we published as part of an NC's working group led by Ben Halpern highlighted the need to put aquatic foods along with all foods on the same table. And this is really pertaining to the fact that traditionally studies of fisheries, aquaculture, and agriculture have all remained separate. And this is something that needs to change as we move towards sustainable food systems in the future. And ultimately, to understand the role of aquatic foods, therefore, we need to understand their role in the global food systems, both now and in the future. And so to this end, over the past few years, myself and researchers in my institute here have been really interested in to try to understand the different linkages associated across different types of food systems spanning land and sea. And I really would like to highlight some of the research of my former PhD student, who is now Dr. Rich Cottrell, and also a postdoc who's coming back to the University of Tasmania. And our work was focused on trying to dig deep into the different types of linkages that do exist to try to then take this further to understand how those linkages actually propagate change in systems. And so the first step here was a broad-scale comprehensive review in which we were able to categorize different types of linkages across food systems. So ecosystem connectivity, livelihood interactions, climate feedbacks, and feed interdependencies were the four that really came out as being really important across land and sea-based food systems. And of course, aquaculture sits very much at the center of these. Today, I'm going to highlight two different types of linkages: that's climate impacts and also feed interdependencies. So in terms of climate change, we know that both land and sea food systems are facing future impacts, and those impacts look to be projecting declines in the overall ceiling of production, both in the sea and on land, in terms of crops on land, that is. And so this is work that was co-led with Simon Jennings and many other people involved here in programs such as FishMIP, for which Cefas has several contributors. And this showed that for most countries, at least, there were projected declines in both terrestrial crop production and terrestrial marine production in terms of production potential. And so the updated projections that we're now in the process of analyzing, that CMIP 6 projections, show an even more pessimistic view of this. And so what this poses are major challenges in terms of increasing food production against a backdrop of what looks to be a declining ceiling of production. So how we do this really needs to be take climate change into account. Now, this study was looking at long-term changing conditions, but we know that with climate change and even in the past, we've seen increasing variability of systems. And these have manifested as increasing shocks in food systems. So we did a study of looking at sudden shocks in food production. And this was also part of Rich's PhD thesis, where we found increasing frequency of shocks across all food systems. And most of these were driven through climate-related events, but also geopolitical events. And certainly nowadays, this really highlights events like COVID in terms of how that's going to ramify through food production systems, and also the role of management interacting with those systems as well. Now, to understand how these changes and shocks actually propagate does require understanding those linkages. And that's something that we were really interested in looking at further, particularly in terms of the linkages associated with feed that I've mentioned earlier, and aquaculture being so central linked to these different, both terrestrial freshwater and marine systems. And so if we look into the future, we can see that all food systems will need to increase the production, but of course they also face impacts that are ongoing due to climate change in the long term, also increased shocks from variability, and potentially competition for supply through the use of shared feed. And of course, the proportion of feed that's used in these different systems has changed through time, so we have to consider that as well. Now, aquaculture in particular has seen a lot of changes. First of all, this rapid rise in production over the past few decades, which has also been accompanied with this decline in its reliance on forage fish, that is the use of fish meal and fish oil in feed, particularly in the past couple of decades. Now, this has resulted from technological improvements in feed, nutrition, as well as the shift towards terrestrial plant-based replacement ingredients, particularly for fish meal, but also for fish oil. And a question that we've been asking with regards to this, looking into the future, is whether this type of shift towards terrestrial forage crops as replacements is really sustainable looking longer into the future. And here we see, looking to the past, this rise of relative production since the 1960s, fed aquaculture here, and nowhere near a steep rise in terms of the production of the major feed crops and major forage fish species going into that this feed ingredients. And so there's this increasing gap in terms of supply. In addition to that, if we look at the efficiencies, and we can consider this in a way, a bit of an environmental efficiency, if we look at a catch per unit effort of forage fish stocks, we see this decline, which is well known and one of the main issues for actually shifting towards terrestrial crops. And certainly it's a large part of the sustainability narrative of aquaculture, is this reduced reliance on forage fish due to that decline in supply. Also lots of drivers related to price, of course, as well. And if we look at crops, we see this rise in relative yields, so yield per hectare. But when you start adjusting that for the fertilizers used, applied on these with these forage crops, you can see also a decline in terms of environmental efficiency. So the yield per unit fertilizer used. So this sort of points to some of the issues associated with the long-term environmental sustainability of crops as sort of a, be careful what you wish for type of replacement, but also points to the need to develop other replacements. And sure enough, the feed industry itself is looking even towards replacement of soy nowadays. So what we're asking are novel feeds the solution. So this is an area of really rapid change in the aquaculture industry. And we want to ask whether, at least in terms of the forage fish, whether we could remain within the proposed limits of forage fish if we were able to replace feeds using novel feed ingredients. And so the business as usual situation where we are using feed ingredients from today doesn't perform very well in terms of remaining within the proposed limits of supply. And so here you can see three scenarios that we looked at: business as usual, rapid growth, and then a consumer shift towards high value, for example, salmonids and shrimp. And you can see each one of those, which will require increasingly more forage fish, does not stay within the limits, the ecological limits of forage fish production. And so to partially address whether novel feeds could provide a solution to this. We compiled lots of studies from experimental work, which was looking at different ingredient replacements. And this was over 400 experiments in over 200 articles, which looked at both replacements in terms of fish meal and fish oil, including insects, soybean bacteria, algae, and yeasts. And we use those to develop a simulation model, which would allow us to determine whether we could optimize feed whilst maintaining the feed conversion ratios, as well as the omega-3 fatty acids provided by fish oil. And the conclusions here were associated with optimal global use of feed ingredients showed that we could vastly improve the use of forage fish demand across these 3 demand scenarios if we optimize the use of feeds globally. And if that was limited to just salmonids and shrimps only, we still were maintained within those limits. But the key to actually achieving those limits was really the combined replacement of fish meal and fish oil. And if it was only one or the other that was replaced, that clearly didn't work. And so this is just considering one dimension of the issue regarding feeds. There are also other socio-ecological and economic drivers that would need to be considered in future. And we are embarking on a 4-year project to look at a wider range of terrestrial and marine ingredients, as well as a suite of impacts at global and local scales, by combining experiments with also modeling results. In addition to this, the solution associated with improving feeds is one small component of a much wider range of solutions that we need to look at. And so I just really wanted to draw attention to this project called Future Seas, which is led by a wonderful group of women at my institute, Greta Petzel, who's the director of the Center for Marine Socioecology, and several others here. And Future Seas is really about envisioning the future and thinking about how we want to get there. And this project has resulted in 15 incoming papers spanning a range of challenges, one which also looks at food for all, designing sustainable and secure seafood systems, led by Anna Barmery. And I just wanted to point out that Cefas are providing excellent and impactful work across a number of these challenges. So a first step is really defining the challenge, thinking about how we'll get there. Another major hurdle we need to get across is, the evidence that's associated with these particular solutions. And so on that note, I'm really excited to hand over the next 4 rapid talks on some of the other directions of solutions that Cefas researchers are examining, which span the future of aquatic foods, both in terms of aquaculture and fisheries.
Hello, I'm Elisa Capuzzo, and I will talk about sustainable aquaculture for healthy food production, in particular seaweed and bivalve aquaculture. The UK has a long tradition of harvesting wild seaweed and bivalve. However, aquaculture of these species, in particular of seaweed, is much more recent. Seaweed and bivalve aquaculture have multiple benefits. They uptake nutrients and carbon from the surrounding environment, therefore improving water quality. They provide habitat for other organisms, increasing local diversity, and they reduce environmental impact compared with other forms of aquaculture. From an health point of view, they are a rich source of nutrients and protein, and they have low carbon footprint and low welfare concern. For example, if you consider mussels, they have approximately the same amount of proteins as beef for a similar portion size. However, production of mussels results in 20 times less emissions of carbon dioxide compared with the production of beef. From a social and economic point of view, This form of aquaculture results in job creation, livelihood diversification, and new value chains. The UK has the potential to further develop this industry, with seaweed and bivalve becoming an important crop around the UK coast. Cefas is supporting the sustainable development of these forms of aquaculture as well as other forms of aquaculture by supporting regulation and licensing, site selection and planning, monitoring and modelling the farm performance as well as the environmental effects. From an health point of view, Cefas work focuses on food safety, biosecurity and understanding and surveilling pathogens and emerging diseases in aquaculture. And under a social and economic aspect, Cefas is engaged with different stakeholders, collecting view and perception, carry out socioeconomic, gender and equality analysis, and also developing feasibility study for aquaculture. I would like to conclude with an example of Cefas work, the development of a mapping tool to guide marine spatial planning. The tool allowed to identify areas which are suitable for aquaculture while minimizing conflict with other existing activity in the areas. This tool is very versatile. It can be applied to different locations at different scales and with different species. And we successfully use it to advise stakeholders both in the UK and abroad. Many thanks for your attention.
So in our expanding world, the global demand for seafood is rising dramatically. However, reports of human health hazards relating to natural seafood toxins are also increasing dramatically in the scientific literature as well as the mass media. So, should we be concerned? And how do we actually turn these potential risks into opportunities for providing sustainable supplies of safe seafood to ever-increasing populations? So these biotoxin hazards are produced naturally by algae or even bacteria. They can be found in both freshwater and seawater environments, and they'll produce a diverse range of chemical compounds such as the saxitoxins or lipophilic toxins shown on this slide. Now these toxins can be accumulated in seafood such as shellfish and fish through their feeding activities. They can have significant impacts on one's health, including the human health of the seafood consumer, animal health, and indeed the health of the entire ecosystem. But these risks can be mitigated against. In EU law, there exist seafood product regulations, which result in the monitoring of water and of mollusks for known biotoxin hazards. The chemical tests we conduct here at Cefas are well validated and accredited, and action is taken to prevent harvesting in regions where the toxins reach above certain limits. In parallel, industry themselves can use test kits such as the lateral flow assays for their own end product testing, which again enables them to not harvest during times of high risk. But these are for known regulated toxins only. So there are multiple changes affecting our planet that result in changes to HABs and the toxins they produce. With increasing global populations and high levels of global aquaculture, in tandem with climatic changes we're all well aware of, and increases in the human inputs into the sea, such as increased pollution, all of these are known to significantly affect algal blooms, both in their proliferation and their toxicity. This can result in new emerging toxins, discoveries of toxins in surprising places such as deep water environments, and more reports of animal and ecosystem health impacts around the globe. So these new emerging risks demand new solutions. There are a range of new measurement tools focusing both on known and unknown threats, and that can measure both the toxins themselves or the causative organisms that produce the toxins. They're also developing ways of modelling the formation of the harmful algal blooms and actually predicting when they may occur and the toxins they may produce, so ultimately resulting in safe food forecasting methods. And finally, there are developing ways of actually preventing the toxins from entering into the seafood through either destruction of the algae in the water column or finally removing the toxins from the seafood if it has indeed been accumulated. But ultimately, it's only through the development and application of a multidisciplinary toolset for monitoring and predicting these harmful algal bloom impacts by multidisciplinary teams that we can guarantee seafood safety in our ever-changing world. Thank you very much for listening.
When you're in the fish and chip shop, you have options about what you want to choose. You can choose cod, haddock, plaice, or maybe scampi, and your choice can be based on taste preference, where you're from, or maybe what choice you consider to be sustainable. Each year, Cefas scientists work with international colleagues to compile survey, biological and commercial catch data and produce annual assessments of the status of stocks and fishing pressure. This results in catch advice and catch limits for each and every stock. Stocks are not caught individually. Most fisheries are mixed and catch several stocks together, for example, in the picture on the right. Some are in a healthy state, supporting sustainable catches, or some need rebuilding and reduced fishing pressure. Our work focuses on new approaches on how to achieve sustainability in mixed fisheries so we can catch what's plentiful and protect what's not. Fisheries target different stocks in space, in time, and using different gears. These technical interactions are what we model in providing mixed fisheries advice, identifying links between fleets on the top, gears on the bottom, and fisheries they take part in, and how that affects outcome in terms of catches and fishing mortality on different stocks. In the figure here, the thicker line, the stronger the interaction. For example, beam trawlers for plaice and sole, and catching to a lesser extent cod. The product of these interactions results in a range of catches for different stocks, some of which are targets and some are bycatch. This is increasingly important to recognise under policies where fleets seek to minimise discards or catching stocks for which they have quota. And these interactions are key when considering the impact of management measures in fisheries, their ability to meet sustainability goals and their impact on fleets. Taking a single example, if you increase catches of sole, how does that affect catches of plaice? This is what we seek to understand so we can provide better advice on managing fisheries. So how do we do this? We combine population models with models that characterize activity of fleets in different fisheries. This provides an explicit link that allows us to take account of these technical interactions in management advice. We use this to address the challenges of managing mixed fisheries. In the short term, to provide advice on where quotas are out of balance for different fleets and what can be done to provide more consistency. This might mean fishing some stocks less than the single stock advice to protect others, for example. In the medium term, evaluating different management approaches from a mixed fisheries perspective, seeking to reduce conflict between stock advice to achieve overall management goals, including evaluating multi-stock quota setting rules or the effect of technical measures and how gear changes and spatial avoidance can break the link among stocks. In the long term, we seek to identify trade-offs and consequences of management options for different fleets and stocks in terms of yield, risk and revenue. At Cefas, we're developing these approaches to provide the next generation of fisheries advice, embedding the principles of our new Fisheries International Centre of Excellence. This enables us to support sustainable fisheries and sustainable choices, irrespective of which stock you choose at the counter.
Hello, welcome. My name is Cefas and I am a statistician. I'll be talking on improving abundance estimates of migratory fish stocks. Most pelagic species, such as mackerel, are highly migratory, making it difficult to fully capture their spatial distribution using a single survey. As a result, multiple data sources are often required for an improved abundance estimate. Usually, fisheries surveys are often designed to satisfy specific fisheries management objectives, and as a result, they yield data with different spatial and temporal coverages. If, for example, interest is on the spatial distribution of mackerel within the North Sea, it is not appropriate to use Apache data such as these from the opportunistic acoustic survey or from the beam trawl survey, as estimates based on these data sets are most likely to be misleading. In fact, even with the International Baton Trawl Survey, which has larger spatial coverage, mackerel could still be missed, largely due to their schooling behavior. However, if we could combine these data sets in a statistically robust manner, we could exploit the strength of each individual survey. We will also have larger sample size and increase statistical power. However, the analysis of such combined data sets is usually very challenging due to the different survey gears employed by each individual survey, as well as the non-random sampling design employed by the acoustic survey, for example. Therefore, advanced statistical methods are often required for their analysis. So recently, we developed advanced statistical technique that allowed us to account for the variability in the observations due to the different survey gears and as well as due to the non-random sampling scheme employed by the acoustic survey. Therefore, we were able to separate noise from the truth. Our statistical method is readily applicable across multiple species and across multiple categories. Thank you.
Thank you. Great set of talks in our Food from Water theme to get us started. Now, in this session on safe seas, we're going to be reflecting on the pressures of human activities. We all know they've got a critical role in our ability to achieve good environmental status, so it's a good place to start. In these talks, we're going to be focusing on nutrient impacts in coastal waters, also reflecting on climate impacts too. So we'll be starting with a great talk by Dr. Mike Best from the Environment Agency, who's a specialist in these topics. That'll then follow with 3 Cefas scientists who'll be talking about the role of catchment management and the opportunity to have more integrated science between the terrestrial environment, the source of contaminants, and the status of our offshore, coastal and offshore marine environment. Those speakers will be Murray Thompson, John Aldridge, and Naomi Greenwood. So let's not delay, let's listen to Dr. Mike Best.
Good morning. The late, great Douglas Adams once said, "What we are concerned with here is the fundamental interconnectedness of all things." He may have been talking about a fictional, holistic detective agency, but the same sentiment applies to safeguarding our seas and the planet. We are facing many crises today, but for current purposes, there are 4 that we wish to consider. The climate crisis, raising of sea temperatures and ocean acidity, the biodiversity or ecological crisis, mass extinctions, changes in communities and habitats, and the nutrient or eutrophication crisis, where increase of nutrients in coastal waters are causing phytoplankton, nuisance or toxic blooms such as sea snot in Turkey, or green tides of nuisance green macroalgae in our intertidal. We have to be aware of bias in these cases because we focus on one thing at a time, often the thing that's shouting the loudest or has finance attached to it or has research grants attached to it, and we forget that they're interconnected and exacerbate or relieve each other's problems. There's a whole synergy going on there, and that brings us to the other crisis which has been with us forever, a crisis in finance. There's never enough money to go around to do things, and that's because there are expectations on scientists and environmental managers to solve problems, and as we discover more problems, these expectation rises. And it doesn't rise at the same rate as the resources, which may flatten off as another crisis such as COVID comes in. And this gap means we have to prioritize things, often to the budget or who's shouting the loudest, but sometimes we can look at it as an innovation gap. And innovations aren't just smart, sexy, shiny stuff, shiny kit, or IT sort of models and machine learnings and artificial intelligence, but they're also ways of working across organizations, working across environmental boundaries, and working across data sets, whether that's citizen science, or whether it's data from the shellfish industry or data from regulators. We have to be smart about how we look at the data, how we make the stories to help us understand what's going on and help us to understand how to fix it. The environment isn't siloed, and neither should we be. There is good news, especially if you're coming at the thing from a water framework or urban wastewater treatment directive sort of approach. Nutrient loads and concentrations are going down. Inshore chlorophyll is going down. A water framework directive regulations, classification for eutrophication are pretty stable. They're not all good, a lot of them are not good, but they're not getting worse. But we do have a problem. Although chlorophyll is reducing in all media, in estuaries, in coastal waters, and further offshore, and it's also reducing at various geographical scales, whether the water framework in the Eastern Channel or the whole of the Channel French coast, or even locally in estuaries, everything may look to be reducing, but cell counts are going up. And you can see this in the Water Framework Directive data. They're increasing quite rapidly. That implies smaller cells. Indeed, when we look at our Water Framework Directive data and we look at the ratio between large and small cells, we can see a trend. Small cells are starting to dominate. This is clearly shown even at individual sites. This is some Cefas work from the Gabbard. The lower graph actually shows an increase in the number of small phytoplankton cells, whereas the large ones are remaining mainly stable or possibly slightly reducing. And that is changing the community. Other inshore life forms are changing. If we compare diatoms and dinoflagellates, diatoms are good crunchy fish food, dinoflagellates not so much and have lots of toxic species associated with them. If we look at that ratio, we can see that there is a trend in that ratio, and that ratio is telling us that there are relatively more dinoflagellates than dinoflagellates as time goes on. We can see this in lots of different places and at lots of different scales, whether it's the Thames or Liverpool Bay. The bottom graph on there shows the dinoflagellate numbers going up quite significantly, and the bottom box on the left hand side is shown how that community has changed from its original place. This tends to be an inshore effect. We see it in our WFD water bodies, which are about 2 nautical miles from shore, but we don't see it very often further offshore. And for instance, at PML's L4 site that's regularly monitored, we don't see it. There is not a trend there. It's bouncing around all over the place. So what's going on? River loads are definitely decreasing, but we are doing better with phosphate than we are with nitrate. We're cleaning up the P better than the N. And so that leads to a change in ratios. Here we're looking at the load, flow times concentration from the rivers coming into the estuaries. Some of this is model data, some of this is real data. It's modeled back to 1940. But if we just look at the 1990s onwards, we can see that there is an upward trend in the load ratios of N to P. That means there is relatively more nitrogen in the load than phosphorus. And we can see, if we look at this decadally, that the inflection is around the 1980s. And if we look at this as a scatter plot, again taking the decades, we can see that that graph is steadily steepening upwards. When we look at the concentration rather than the loads in our various water bodies, we can see that the dissolved organic nitrogen concentrations are coming down, as are the dissolved organic phosphate, but they're coming down in different rates, which means that the ratio is going up in favour of N. There is more N than P. When we look at L4, a bit more offshore, we don't see that. It occasionally reflects big flood events, but we don't see that consistent trend. The effect is basically in the areas of freshwater influence, bright green on these maps. And we can see that L4 is outside those bright green areas. And those bright green areas don't entirely match. They spill beyond our water bodies, those lines there, particularly obvious at the Isle of Wight, where we can see there's quite a southerly influence of fresh water into the deeper, clearer waters to the south of the Isle of Wight. That corresponds with where we quite often see plankton blooms, toxic and nuisance plankton, such as the Sudanicha bloom last month. It's a different story when you go offshore. We have the same good news. Chlorophyll's coming down, primary production is coming down. Even total cell counts are pretty stable. This is in the Western Channel, but they're pretty stable everywhere. There's no big trends up or down like we saw inshore. When we look at the life forms, the dinoflagellates on the bottom orange line are not showing any upward trends like we saw inshore. Maybe the diatoms are going up slightly. And so there's a very gentle change, but it is the opposite of what we were seeing inshore. This shows it mapped out into particular squares using CPR data, and we can see the dinoflagellates on the bottom are strongly inversely correlated with sea surface temperature rises. The decline in dinoflagellates are strongly correlated with sea surface temperature rises, so weakly correlated. But as we go further offshore and look at even smaller things, so we've been looking at the microplankton and nanoplankton, when we start looking at the picoplankton, and the picoplankton are that mixed group of bacteria, blue-greens and very small phytoplankton, they are significant in primary productivity, up to a third inshore and over 80% offshore. We can see changes. PML have done a 30-year study showing the biomass at L4 is declining in the traditional phytoplankton, but the picoplankton is taking over, and further offshore where we have frontal systems and water stratification, in the summer the phytoplankton decline, but they are dominated by the picoplankton. The picoplankton take over, and correlated with that is a reduction in the copepods, quite a significant reduction in the copepods. And the explanation for this is that there is a nutrient stress going through the food web structure. Traditionally, where we've got iron and NO3 in our more inshore waters, there's an efficient food chain. Diatoms, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, are eaten by copepods, are eaten by fish larvae. Where it is more nutrient and iron starved, there is not so good a quality food structure and a longer food chain, and so that food quality is not so good. Less copepods, less good food for fish. The phytoplankton community is changing. Inshore, dinoflagellates are going up, strongly correlating with nutrient ratios, concomitantly with the smaller phytoplankton. Offshore, although we have increases in diatoms, there's a big decrease in the dinoflagellates, and that has a weak correlation with changes in sea surface temperature. As we go further offshore, the picoplankton are changing, and that probably correlates with climate change, changes in stratification. And that's rippling through to some of the zooplankton life form changes that we're starting to see. This implies we have less and lower quality food for other organisms. How this is rippling up the food chain, we don't really know. To manage this, we have to think broader, source to sink, and outside our individual silos and boxes. So You may be measuring your adult fish or your seabird chicks today, and the problems you see may be due to poor quality and quantity of food. And that could have happened 6 months to a year beforehand due to phytoplankton disturbances, which may be due to nutrient disbalances coming down the catchment, and that may be due to land practices going back 15 or 20 years. And we've actually seen that when we sort of switch off the nutrient input into one of the southern harbours, it takes about 15 years for the nuisance green macroalgae to start showing a decline. So we have to think in different time scales and spatial scales and join the dots. Basically, there are indirect effects and they need indirect measures. So if we measure that the phytoplankton is changing significantly, we might not be able to fix that quickly, but we could take a measure to take the pressures off the fishery and the larval fish while doing something about the diffuse nutrient inputs to the system. So we have to think much more broadly and much more joined up. And it's quite complex. That diagram should really be much more complicated than that. But if we take it at different scales, we can manage it. So water framework regulation, water body scale, we look at the catchments, the incoming nutrients, we look at the nutrient ratios, we look at how that's impacting the phytoplankton community, not necessarily with our current tool set. Climate change means we have to consider sediment supply and light supply to the estuaries as well as we get different flooding and different patterns of water flow. And as that spreads out into the area of freshwater influence, we have a local regional seas effect, and that's where the big community and life form changes are happening. And further offshore, the wider UK seas, we're seeing dominated by climate issues and then the bigger sort of fishing sector issues. And we can see that offshore because it's not masked by the nutrient impacts inshore, and that's how we have to consider the whole balance of these things. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Murray Thompson, and I'm going to talk about how rewilding recovers biodiversity in river food webs. First though, why is this important and why do we do this at Cefas? Cefas work from headwaters at the top of catchments to the coast and beyond, and safe seas depend on healthy headwaters. Most fish living in this stretch of the River Bure are trout, which migrate to the sea, and of course the water goes to sea too, along with any pollutants in it. Overexploitation, pollution and habitat destruction are causing global declines in freshwater biodiversity, especially in running waters. Despite widespread improvements in river water quality, ecological recovery has often been patchy or even entirely lacking. In rivers, rewilding practices that reinstate natural processes, such as tree fall, are gaining traction. However, causal evidence for its effectiveness is lacking due to a scarcity of replicated field experiments. During my PhD back in 2010, I started a rewilding experiment where trees were felled into rivers to recreate natural tree fall. I used a control site where no restoration took place and an impact site surveying these before and after restoration and replicated this across 5 rivers. I also found sites where naturally fallen trees had been in place for several years prior to the study, which provided a target site. Put simply, we studied the effects of restoration by comparing sites with no trees to those restored with trees. When I started at Cefas, DEFRA funded an extension to this work to understand whether sea-bound species populations, such as salmon, trout and eel, were enhanced as a result of rewilding. This has provided a 10-year perspective. This hypothetical plot shows a river food web with feeding links from abundant microscopic algae called diatoms, the green circles, to large and less abundant invertebrates, the yellow squares, and then to larger and less abundant fish, the blue diamonds. So-called trivariate food webs use information on species mass and their abundance and feeding links between them simultaneously. This provides information on biodiversity change, such as in the number of species, their interactions, and the rate energy fluxes through the system. We hypothesized that restoration would provide more habitat for invertebrates, which would in turn support more fish, and these would be evident through an increase in invertebrate species, numbers and mass, followed by an increase in fish numbers and mass, and also a decrease in invertebrate resources, the diatoms. Restoration was rapid, comparable across target and restored sites, and sustained over 10 years. with higher invertebrate biomass in the woody habitat and an increase in the number of different invertebrate prey species available to fish. There was higher fish biomass, food web complexity, and energy flux in the restored and target sites. Diatoms did not decrease in the woody sites. Instead, we saw an increase in leaf litter, which is another key food resource for invertebrates. So bringing this back to safe seas, tree fall in rivers enhances populations of sea-bound fish species. Thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is John Aldridge and I'm an environmental modeller based at Cefas Lowestoft. We've just heard about rivers and river management. Often the next link in the chain between rivers and the sea are estuaries. Here I'll talk about how modelling can aid in understanding and addressing estuarine problems, helping to achieve better environmental conditions in both estuaries and coastal seas. Why are estuaries valuable? Estuaries are characterised by the transition from fresh to saltwater conditions, often giving rise to strong gradients in salinity, turbidity and pH. The characteristic features of estuaries, such as intertidal flats, tidal channels and salt marshes, can be important habitats for seagrasses, invertebrates, fish and birds. Estuaries are highly visible and visited by the public, and consequences of pollution here are often more noticeable than in the sea, for example. And also there could be sites for commercial activities such as aquaculture that rely on a clean and safe environment. The animation here shows a simulation from a model of an estuary. From it we can see how inputs from the rivers move through the estuary, driven by tidal mixing and river flows, eventually making their way out into the sea. The substance being transported here could represent a contaminant such as bacteria from sewage discharges, chemicals from agriculture or industry, or nutrients from land runoff and wastewater treatment plants. We can easily see in the video inputs from rivers, but notice also water from the sea drawn into the estuary by the tidal flow. In some cases, this marine input can be important. In particular, excess biological production in an estuary can draw in nutrients from marine as well as river sources. Excess primary productivity driven by high nutrient loads can be a problem in both estuarine and coastal environments. In many estuaries, the excessive growth of opportunistic green seaweed species is an undesirable consequence of high nutrient loads. These seaweeds can smother intertidal areas, decreasing biodiversity and leading to problems in meeting regulatory standards. Combining hydrodynamic modelling, such as shown in the previous slide, with models of seaweed growth can provide an understanding of the contribution of different nutrient sources, river, estuarine or coastal, to seaweed biomass and allow different options for reducing seaweed biomass to be explored. In partnership with the Environment Agency, tools such as the combined phytoplankton macroalgal model have been developed at Cefas to help with this. The model results plotted here, for example, show the contribution of different nutrient sources to seaweed biomass over an annual cycle. In summary then, estuaries provide unique habitats for many species and problems can be highly visible to the public. We must consider both upstream rivers and downstream marine sources of contaminants to understand and manage estuaries, and models can help with this. And certainly safe and healthy rivers and estuaries will help ensure safe and healthy seas. Thank you.
Continuing along the catchment to coast journey, this presentation looks at the impact of freshwater plumes in the coastal environment. So why should we care? Well, 80% of the pollution in our seas comes from land, either from direct discharges such as sewage or from diffuse runoff such as from agricultural activity. Understanding the source of these pollutants and the impact they have is critical to ensuring safe seas. The impact of pollution in the UK coastal environment is well documented, such as changes in the marine food web, as highlighted by Mike. Inputs of industrial and pharmaceutical contaminants and viruses and pathogens from human sewage and animal waste have adverse effects on the health of fish, shellfish and humans. There's a complex array of policies that lead to a fragmented approach to management across the freshwater to marine environment, and we need tools which improve our understanding of the input and fate of freshwater and the associated pollutants now and under a changing climate. The example I provide in this talk is for Liverpool Bay in northwest England, but it is applicable across the coastal environment. It's a region facing many pressures, including agricultural, urban and industrial inputs from the catchment, aquaculture and recreation near the coast, energy generation offshore, and changes in climate. So the graph on the left shows that the marine environment receives large nutrient inputs from the rivers. There's now an extreme imbalance in nutrients in the coastal environment, shown by the blue upward arrow. This follows the success or otherwise of nutrient reduction policies. Colleagues have developed models to understand the flow of water through the catchments to the estuary and use them to explore how freshwater input and associated pollutants might change under a future climate or under different land management. The graph on the right shows the distribution of predicted river flow for the River Clwyd now and under 2 emission scenarios for a 5-year period between 2034 and 2038. The model predicts higher baseline river flow, shown by the dotted line, with higher variability and greater extremes, which will have consequences for how and when pollutants are delivered into the coastal environment. So we also need to understand the extent of the freshwater impact in the coastal environment. Colleagues have developed freshwater plume monitoring using ocean colour data from Sentinel-3 satellites. The image on the left shows the variation in the extent of the freshwater plume, depicted in green, in Liverpool Bay for every month in 2018. The freshwater extent varies seasonally with river discharge, shown by the plot below the satellite image. And when we combine this with monitoring data, we can show that the freshwater extent correlates with the pollutant load. So using the combination of catchment modelling, earth observation and in situ monitoring provides a greater understanding of the extent and impact of freshwater pollutants in the coastal environment. This work predicts a future increase in the extent of freshwater pollutants and changes in when they enter the bay. Whilst we can monitor pollutants in the marine environment, many of the decisions we make for our marine waters need to be made by working with partners upstream well before the water enters the marine environment to reduce pollutant inputs to our coasts and to ensure safe seas. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. What a great set of talks for our morning session. Thanks to everyone who's highlighted the really significant challenges we're facing in our seas and oceans. I've been struck by the range of science disciplines that have been necessary to address all these issues, from statisticians to modelers, chemists to population ecologists. It's really important we continue to fund and maintain those integrated projects and those skills in our early career scientists. So now we've got a 5-minute break and we'll be playing a video describing the work of the Blue Belt programme, which is aiming to establish marine protection across our overseas territories. After that, we'll be hosting a number of focused discussion groups. Now, if you've already expressed an interest in joining one of those focused discussion groups, then you can join using the Microsoft Teams invitation that you've already been sent. There's discussions on science careers, a day in the life of the research vessel, our fish health inspectorate, and the work of the plankton and benthic teams. If you haven't expressed an interest but you'd quite like to, then have a look at your email that was sent this morning with details of how you can register. Otherwise, stay online and you'll be able to watch a set of talks by our Cefas PhD students. But please could I ask you not to copy or tweet any of the images, because the results of some of the talks are still in review in peer-reviewed journals. So that's it. Everyone will need to rejoin us on live events at exactly 12 o'clock for our science panel discussion led by Gideon Henderson. And when you do so, don't forget you'll need to use a new link for the afternoon session, not this one. And that will be in your invitation as well. That's it. Thank you and see you soon.
Wildlife is my passion, and the marine environment is my favorite place to be. So I love the fact that I get to work with scientists who are discovering new species in this part of the world.
The Blue Belt programme set out to protect 4 million square kilometres of ocean around the UK overseas territories.
The UK overseas territories that are part of the Blue Belt programme are Ascension Island, British Antarctic Territory, British Indian Ocean Territory, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, Pitcairn Islands, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha.
For Ascension and Tristan, the Blue Belt programme really started right at the very beginning, from engaging with those territories for a desire to enhance their marine protection, working right through to data gathering to understand what was in their waters, to help them identify what sort of management regime would be best for them to put in place, and then going on to help with the legislation.
In 2019, the Blue Belt helped support an expedition to Henderson Island to really highlight the issues of marine plastics in the South Pacific. Some of the coral reefs we saw were absolutely fantastic. And I'm talking about full carpets of colourful corals, some of the most deep corals I've ever seen as well.
For effective marine protected areas and effective management, it's really, really important that they're underpinned by strong governance. That can be having the right policy and legal framework in place, and also making sure that the management measures have teeth. So they have a really important site for whale sharks in St. Helena. The Blue Belt programme worked with St. Helena government. We've assisted in developing a marine tourism policy, and we're also working on marine tourism regulations. If you don't have the right governance in place, then the management measures won't work.
During an expedition just north of St. Helena, we were working with some local mariners who were talking about an area they like to fish, and they were talking about how shallow it was in this area. Turned out that there was a massive seamount in this location. It was something twice the size of Ben Nevis, previously been uncharted and was unknown to science.
Working with the British Indian Ocean Territory, we've been able to help them in prosecuting vessels operating in their marine waters. And also in the case of the Nika, which was operating illegally down in South Georgia.
I think the major decisions that have been made by these overseas territories is a strong commitment to marine protection in its exclusive economic zones. These overseas territory governments have made massive commitments to protect their waters for biodiversity, for sustainable fishing, and for future protection.
Although Tristan da Cunha is a remote island in the middle of the ocean, it has previously had impacts from oil pollution where the MS Oliver ran aground and spilled its cargo and its fuel, causing a real problem for the environment and the habitats there. And what the Blue Belt programme has done is to work proactively with Tristan da Cunha government to help them understand better the volume of shipping traffic and the risk posed. And then with that information, we've helped establish an area to be avoided, to keep the shipping traffic further away from the main islands and reduce that collision risk.
reducing the detrimental impact of human activity has been a really important part of the Blue Belt programme. Human impacts can kind of be put into two different categories. On the one hand, you've got the kind of the local human impacts, but then you've got those more global problems like climate change and marine litter. And we can kind of direct measures in place through management plans or legislation.
The Blue Belt has been such a unique programme, bringing together people that haven't worked together before with a really clear objective of enhancing the marine environment. So what makes me really enthused is that we're actually having a demonstrable effect on those marine environments. You can actually see where there has been improvements, including return of species, more abundance, cleaner oceans, better resilience to climate change. So really making a positive, demonstrable benefit for the overseas territories and for the rest of the planet.
These remote marine waters need our protection, our care, and our passion for the future.